In Module 5, we look at risk and uncertainty modelling. Now, risk is probably the most important issue in finance. You'll find that bankers are always talking about risk. What we need to do is look closely at exactly what risk means to the property investor. And to do this, we're going to go through a presentation which looks at the way that risk is considered, the different types of risk, and then we're going to look at the specific forms of risk that you have in property investment. After that, we're going to look at techniques for applying uncertainty analysis to your DCF model. And so the real focus of this module is continuing to put more into your DCF model. This time we're not doing more analysis as such in terms of number crunching. What we're doing is looking at ways of analysing uncertainty in the variables. And in that we're going to introduce notions like sensitivity analysis, scenario analysis, Monte Carlo, and so on. We're going to see that some of these are more effective than others, and hopefully you'll come away with an understanding that our whole grasp of risk is in fact quite rubbery. And by that I mean that risk of its very nature infers something that we don't understand, some uncertainty. And while we can classify risk, we can't fully analyse it or scientifically kind of grasp it. The other practical problem with risk is getting sufficient data to be able to confidently talk about what's going to happen in the future. And even if we did, we would then have the problem of guessing whether the future is going to look like the past. And this leads us into consideration of the cyclical nature of the economy in general and the property markets in particular. While we talk about property cycles, and anyone who works in property is very concerned about property cycles, it's also important to be aware that property doesn't actually follow cycles. It does follow fluctuations, but there's certainly nothing like a cycle. And this idea of differentiating between a cycle, which infers a certain amount of regularity and predictability, with fluctuations, which is a bit like the waves on the ocean, that come when they want to, might appear to be in some way cyclical, but are in fact are really kind of pseudo-random. If you're involved in property investment, especially finance property investment, this pseudo-cyclical kind of behaviour of the markets in general, in particular property markets, becomes a very important consideration. For those of you who are a little older, you may have remembered the last cycle where, before the crash came, everyone was very optimistic and considered that property was never going to look poorly. But then afterwards, everyone was shaking themselves, wondering how much money they'd lost, and trying to work out how to move forward. It turns out that that behaviour is no different to the previous cycles, whether it was in the late 80s, the early 70s, the 1930s Great Depression, 1890s, 1830s, and all the way back to the beginning of modernity. We find that this whole question of the uncertainty of the business environment, especially when it's magnified through the whole process of risk of debt leverage, tends to make the risk of failure due to this unexpected change in the fluctuations of the property market extremely important for all aspects of property investment, but especially for property development. However, in this model, all we're going to be doing is looking fairly closely at this question of risk. I recommend that you take this topic carefully. There is one chapter of Roland, chapter 9, that we're asking you to read, but also work through the exercises and the presentations and give some thought to what's going on around you and how what is in the presentations can apply to it. One thing which is very important for a shrewd investor is to not be caught up in the enthusiasm of the moment, either the positive enthusiasm where everyone thinks that markets can only go up and property will only make you money, to the negative kind of sentiments in the market that follow a depression or a recession, some sort of a downturn. Generally, the people who come out on top in property investment are the people who operate counter-cyclically. And by that I mean when everybody else is selling, you buy. and when everyone else is buying, you sell. I hope you find this module interesting because it's certainly important. And for anyone who is considering getting involved in property investment, it is probably one of the most important topics to consider, after leverage, of course.